Now, for me, it's a no-brainer that the constant watching by young people, mainly young boys and young men, of violent video games is bound to desensitize the viewer to violence, make them lower the threshold, if you like, of their moral qualms about that violence. I've thought that for years. I've been saying it for years here on TalkSport. Professor Bruce Bartholomew is from the Department of Psychological Sciences at the University of Missouri, and he is part of a group who have been studying and using some very, very clever methodologies to study the desensitizing effect that repeated watching of violent scenes on these video games clearly has. And Professor Bartholomew has been very kind to join us now. Professor, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Would you talk us through this new research on this subject, please?
Sure. Well, I think the most recent research is actually conducted by a different group who I'm not specifically associated with, but it's the same basic idea, and that is that we recruit individuals, usually young men, as you said, or late teens, who have different kinds of experiences with video games. So usually we have a group who play a lot of the violent games, and then a group who either don't play the games, or if they do, they play less violent types, maybe sport types or racing, things like that. And then what we'll often do is attach a number of sensors to their scalp that measure their brain activity, or in the case of the most recent work that was just published, actually put them into a functional brain scanner, so the kind that produce the color pictures that people are familiar with.
Yes.
And then show them different kinds of images. And in our research, we usually show them a range of things from very neutral pictures, say a man sitting at a bus stop, to very violent pictures, say a man pointing a gun in another man's mouth, things like that. And then another set of pictures that are equally negative but are not violent, so maybe a baby that has a really nasty tumor on the side of her face. And what we tend to look for is evidence that the brain responds differently to the violent images as a function of exposure to violent video games. And what we have found now in several studies, and other groups as well, is that the boys or young men exposed to the violent video games tend to show a muted, smaller brain response to the violent images compared to the other kinds of images that we show them. And that's not the case with the low gamers or the people who play non-violent games.
Mm. How violent does it get, Professor?
In terms of the games themselves?
The games themselves, yes. I mean, many of the listeners, I hope most of them, are not habitués of these horror rooms. Just give us a flavour of how brutal these things have become.
Oh, it's as ghastly as you can imagine. So using multiple kinds of weapons, all kinds of guns, knives, grenades, bombs, and everything down to fists to obliterate opponents, so to try and eviscerate them, sort of take their spine out, cut their heads off, blow them up. Anything you can sort of think of has been shown in these games. And often what's kind of disturbing from a psychological standpoint is that the more brutal one attacks the opponent, the more points that they receive. So they're actually being rewarded continuously for engaging in this kind of virtual, violent and aggressive behavior.
So it makes Tarantino look like Disney, doesn't it?
In some sense, yeah, sure does.
And these are really big business now, these games, aren't they? I mean, some of the launch of these new video game products are kind of bigger box office than the movies are nowadays.
Yeah, by a long ways. In fact, sales of video games for more than a decade have outpaced movie sales by a long ways. So they're extremely popular, very prevalent, and wide-ranging. So it goes from, you know, the young kids all the way to now young and middle-aged adults, especially men.
Now, are you picking up in the criminal justice system any correlation between the obsessive watching of these things and actual violence and crime.
There is that correlation, yes. Now, we need to be careful before we assume a causal relationship there. We have demonstrated causal associations between exposure to these kinds of video games and aggressive behaviors in the laboratory. That finding is pretty well established. And when we look at, say, violent crime and other things that occur or in the penal system, there are often associations there, but we need to be careful because we have not conducted the kind of randomized trials that would be necessary to establish that engaging in violent crime is really causally related to playing these kinds of games.
And there's no real policing of these games. There can't be, really, can there? I mean, you can put a certificate X on these things, or even triple X, but once these things are sold, you have absolutely no control over who's watching them.
That's correct, yeah. I mean, the entertainment industry, the video game industry, tries to regulate who gets a hold of them simply by placing a rating on the outside of the game, which in theory should limit who can purchase the games. But often what we find in a lot of our studies is that parents will purchase games for their children, often without paying any attention to the ratings, simply because the children want them. So they're not as good a police as you would hope for them to be. But I don't think we should blame the parents, at least not entirely. I mean, I think that the industry itself should
Of
be
course they do.
engaging in better efforts.
Yeah. What kind of people are they that want to make money out of brutalizing young people by ever more graphic and extreme violent imagery?
Well, right, and it draws parallels with other kinds of industries that have profited off of young people becoming addicted to things like tobacco, and so they make a huge profit while the consumers of their product actually suffer for it.
At least pornographers are held in public opprobrium. But these people are off with the prize without any real public dissatisfaction or dislike in any way expressed to them. I'm one of the few people banging on about this in the media.
Well, I think you're right, and here in the U.S., of course, and probably Britain as well, one of the arguments often put forth by the industry is that they have kind of freedom of expression and freedom of commerce and so on, and that any attempt at limiting their freedom would be tantamount to violating the Constitution.
The last refuge of the scoundrel, Professor.
I think you might be right. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for that very helpful introduction to this subject. That's Professor Bruce Bartholo from the University of Missouri,